The silence in the abandoned warehouse was broken only by the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe overhead. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat bound to a metal chair, his military uniform torn and bloodied, but his eyes remained defiant. Across from him, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man he had trusted with his life just weeks before. "You look surprised, Captain," said Colonel Amadou Sankara, his voice carrying a mixture of regret and determination. "Did you really think your revolution could continue without consequences?" Traoré tested the ropes around his wrists, feeling the rough fibers cut into his skin. "Amadou, what have you done? We swore an oath together. We fought side by side to free Burkina Faso from corruption." Sankara stepped into the dim light cast by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. His face, once warm and brotherly, now appeared cold and calculating. "That was before I learned the truth about your plans, Ibrahim. Before I discovered what you really intended for our country." The warehouse stood on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, far from the presidential palace where Traoré's supporters believed their leader was attending a routine security briefing. In reality, he had been lured here by a message claiming to reveal a foreign plot against his government. Now he realized he had walked directly into a trap set by his most trusted ally. "What truth?" Traoré demanded, his voice echoing in the empty space. "What lies have they filled your head with?" Sankara pulled up a wooden crate and sat down, his assault rifle resting across his knees. "The Americans came to me 3 days ago. They showed me documents, Ibrahim. Financial records, communication intercepts, evidence of your secret negotiations with Moscow. You sold us out to the Russians." The accusation hit Traoré like a physical blow. He leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow. "You fool. Those documents are fabricated. Can't you see they're manipulating you? The same powers that kept Africa under their thumb for decades are using you to destroy everything we've built." But Sankara shook his head slowly. "I've seen the evidence with my own eyes. The money transfers, the weapons shipments, the promises you made to Putin's representatives. You were going to turn Burkina Faso into a Russian satellite state." Outside the warehouse, the sun was beginning to set over the Sahel, casting long shadows through the grimy windows. Traoré knew that his security detail would soon realize he was missing, but would they be able to find him in time? More importantly, could he convince his oldest friend that he was being manipulated by foreign intelligence services? "Amadou, listen to me," Traoré said, his voice taking on the same tone he had used to rally troops during their early days as young officers. "Do you remember when we were stationed at Kaya? When the French military advisors told us that African soldiers could never lead their own forces effectively?" Sankara's expression softened slightly at the memory. "I remember. And what did we promise each other that night? What oath did we take under the stars? We swore that we would never let outsiders control our destiny again," Sankara replied quietly. "Exactly. And now you're doing exactly what they want. You're eliminating the one leader who refused to bow to their demands. Whether it's Paris, Washington, or Moscow, they all want the same thing, a puppet they can control." Sankara stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Don't try to manipulate me with nostalgia, Ibrahim. I've made my decision. The Americans have promised to support a transitional government. There will be elections, a return to civilian rule." Traoré laughed bitterly. "Elections? You mean the kind they held in Mali, where the same corrupt politicians returned to power? Or perhaps like those in Niger, where nothing changed except the faces in the presidential palace? Amadou, you're not just betraying me, you're betraying every soldier who died believing in our cause." The colonel's jaw tightened, but Traoré could see doubt creeping into his eyes. This was his chance. "Tell me something," Traoré continued. "When these Americans approached you, what exactly did they offer? Money? A position in the new government? Safe passage out of the country if things go wrong?" Sankara turned away, walking toward the window. "They offered stability. An end to the chaos." "Whose stability? Whose version of order?" Traoré pressed. "The same stability that kept us exporting our gold and uranium to foreign companies while our people lived in poverty. The same order that maintained foreign military bases on our soil while our own army lacked basic equipment." The warehouse fell silent except for that persistent dripping. Sankara stared out at the darkening sky, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Show me proof, Ibrahim. Show me proof that you weren't selling us to the Russians." "The proof is in what I've refused to do," Traoré replied. "Have you seen Russian bases being built? Have you seen our resources being handed over to Moscow instead of remaining under national control? The only difference between my approach and the old regime is that I refuse to choose between competing masters." Sankara turned back toward him, conflict clear on his face. "But the documents can be fabricated by any intelligence service with sufficient resources. The Americans have been perfecting these techniques for decades. They create just enough truth mixed with lies to make their story believable." But that was only the beginning of Traoré's fight for survival. Even as he worked to plant seeds of doubt in Sankara's mind, he could hear vehicles approaching the warehouse. Through the dirty windows, he glimpsed the headlights of several SUVs pulling up outside. "Your American friends?" Traoré asked. Sankara nodded grimly. "They want to debrief you before the transition." The warehouse doors burst open, and 6 men in tactical gear entered, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the fading light. They moved with the precise efficiency of professional operators, not the somewhat chaotic energy of local military forces. The lead operative, a tall man with graying temples, approached Traoré's chair. When he spoke, his accent confirmed Traoré's suspicions. "Captain Traoré, I'm Agent Morrison, Central Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss your relationship with Russian intelligence services." Traoré met the American's gaze steadily. "I have no relationship with Russian intelligence services. But I'm beginning to understand your relationship with African military officers." Morrison pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "We have records of payments totaling $15 million transferred to accounts under your control. These funds originated from Russian state-owned enterprises." "Interesting," Traoré replied calmly. "And I suppose you also have documentation showing exactly when and how I supposedly accessed these accounts." The CIA operative's hesitation was brief but telling. "The investigation is ongoing." Sankara stepped forward, his rifle still in hand. "Morrison, you told me you had complete evidence." "We do, Colonel. These transfers are just one piece of a larger puzzle." But Traoré could see that his friend was beginning to understand the game being played. "Amadou, ask him about the timing. When were these alleged payments made?" Morrison shot a warning look at Sankara, but the colonel was already asking the question. "When did these transfers occur?" "The financial activity dates back approximately 18 months, Morrison replied carefully. Traoré smiled grimly. 18 months ago, I was still a mid-level officer with no political influence whatsoever. I had no access to government resources and no reason for anyone to bribe me. The timeline doesn't make sense, and they know it. Sankarah's expression was changing rapidly as the implications sank in. Morrison, explain this discrepancy. The CIA operative glanced at his men, and Traoré noticed their hands moving toward their weapons. The situation was about to escalate dramatically. Colonel Sankarah, Morrison said slowly, sometimes intelligence work requires accepting information that may seem incomplete at first glance. The important thing is preventing Russian influence from taking root in West Africa. The important thing, Traoré interjected, is preventing any foreign influence from taking root. But that's not what this is about, is it, Morrison? This is about maintaining American access to our mineral resources and military cooperation agreements. Morrison's professional mask began to slip. Captain, your government has been moving away from established partnerships that have maintained regional stability for decades. You mean partnerships that maintained American and European control over African resources? Traoré shot back. We terminated those agreements because they were designed to keep us dependent and impoverished. The tension in the warehouse was becoming palpable. Sankarah looked back and forth between Traoré and Morrison, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties and growing suspicions about American motives. No one expected what came next. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted outside the warehouse, followed by shouts in French and local languages. Morrison's team immediately took defensive positions, their weapons drawn and trained on the entrances. What the hell is happening out there? Morrison barked into his radio. The response came through static-filled bursts. Contact. Multiple vehicles. Armed personnel. Sankarah moved to the window and peered outside. Those are government forces. Ibrahim's presidential guard. Traoré felt a surge of hope mixed with concern for his men's safety. Amadou, you need to make a choice right now. Are you going to stand with foreign operatives against your own countrymen, or are you going to remember who you really are? Morrison grabbed Sankarah's arm. Colonel, we had an agreement. If you help us now, we can still proceed with the transition plan. But Sankarah was staring at the American's hand on his arm with obvious disgust. Take your hand off me. The CIA operative released him but continued pressing. Think about your country's future, Colonel. Think about the stability we can provide. Whose stability? Sankarah echoed Traoré's earlier words. And at what cost? The firefight outside was intensifying. Through the windows, they could see muzzle flashes and hear the distinctive sound of government-issued AK-47s returning fire against the Americans' more sophisticated weapons. Morrison was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with his team and apparently calling for extraction. The operation was falling apart, and everyone in the warehouse knew it. Last chance, Colonel, Morrison said to Sankarah. Come with us now, and you'll have American protection and support. Stay here, and you'll go down with Traoré's regime. Sankarah looked at the American operative with newfound clarity. You know what I just realized? You never asked me what I wanted for Burkina Faso. You never asked what my vision was for our people's future. You only told me what you needed me to do. Without another word, Sankarah raised his rifle and pointed it at Morrison. Release Captain Traoré, now. The other CIA operatives immediately swung their weapons toward Sankarah, creating a tense Mexican standoff in the middle of the warehouse. The sound of the battle outside continued to grow closer. Morrison raised his hand slowly. Colonel, you're making a mistake that will cost your country dearly. The only mistake I made was trusting you in the first place, Sankara replied, his voice steady despite the weapons trained on him. I said release him. Traoré watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that his friend had just made a decision that would change both their lives forever, but they still needed to survive the next few minutes. The warehouse doors suddenly exploded inward as government forces breached the building. Soldiers in burkina uniforms poured through the openings, their weapons ready and their faces set with determination. Drop your weapons, shouted Major Kone, Traoré's chief of security. You are surrounded. Morrison's team found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. After a moment of tense silence, the CIA operative nodded to his men, and they slowly lowered their weapons. As Major Kone's soldiers secured the Americans, Sankara hurried to untie Traoré's restraints. His hands shook slightly as he worked to free his friend and commander. Ibrahim, I'm sorry, Sankara whispered. I almost made the worst mistake of my life. Traoré rubbed his wrists as the circulation returned to his hands. Amadou, we all make mistakes. What matters is recognizing them before it's too late. Morrison was being zip-tied by government soldiers, but he continued trying to influence the situation. Captain Traoré, this incident will have serious diplomatic consequences. The United States government will not tolerate the detention of its personnel. Traoré stood up slowly, his muscles cramped from hours of being bound. Agent Morrison, your government has just been caught attempting to overthrow a sovereign African nation. I think you'll find that we have more leverage in this situation than you realize. Major Kone approached his commander with obvious relief. Sir, we tracked your phone signal to this location. Are you injured? I'm fine, Major. But we need to document everything that happened here. This warehouse contains evidence of foreign interference in our internal affairs. As the government forces secured the scene, Traoré pulled Sankara aside for a private conversation. The two men walked to a quiet corner of the warehouse, away from the controlled chaos of the operation's aftermath. Amadou, I need to know, how many other officers did they approach? How deep does this conspiracy go? Sankara looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. They contacted at least 6 senior officers that I know of. The plan was to arrest you during tomorrow's cabinet meeting and announce a military council to oversee new elections. Who else was involved? Colonels Bambara and Ouedraogo definitely. Probably Major Tall and Commander Zongo as well. They were promised positions in the transitional government. Traoré nodded grimly. The conspiracy was broader than he had feared, but at least now he knew the scope of the problem. We'll need to act quickly to prevent them from implementing their backup plans. But the immediate crisis was far from over. Even as they spoke, Traoré's phone was buzzing with urgent messages from government officials and military commanders across the country. Word of the evening's events was already spreading, and he needed to control the narrative before his enemies could regroup. Major Kone returned with a status report. Sir, we have 6 American operatives in custody, including their leader. What are your orders regarding their detention? Traoré considered the question carefully. Holding CIA personnel could create an international incident, but releasing them would send the wrong message about sovereignty and foreign interference. Transport them to the secure facility at Camp Naba Koum. They will be treated according to international law, but they will remain in custody pending a full investigation of their activities. Morrison overheard this exchange and called out from across the warehouse. Captain, you're making a decision that will isolate your government internationally. No one will support a regime that detains American personnel. Agent Morrison, Traoré replied calmly, I think you'll find that many nations will support a government that refuses to be overthrown by foreign intelligence services. The world is changing, and Africa is no longer willing to accept external manipulation. As the prisoners were being prepared for transport, Sankara remained at Traoré's side. Ibrahim, what happens now? The Americans won't simply abandon their plans because this operation failed. No, they won't. But now we know who they're working with, and we have evidence of their interference. That changes the game considerably. The two men walked outside into the cool night air. The battle was over, with several CIA vehicles destroyed or abandoned and American personnel either captured or fled. Government forces were securing the perimeter and collecting evidence. Traoré looked up at the stars, the same stars under which he and Sankara had sworn their oath as young soldiers. Amadou, do you remember what we used to say about the hardest battles? That they're fought not against external enemies, but against the doubts in our own hearts, Sankara replied quietly. Exactly. Tonight you faced that battle and won. But the war for our country's independence is just beginning. As if to underscore his words, Traoré's secure phone rang with an encrypted call from his intelligence chief. The conversation was brief but alarming. Sir, came the voice through the secure line, we have reports of unusual military movements in 3 provinces. It appears the American operation tonight was coordinated with other destabilization efforts. Traoré ended the call and turned to Major Kone. Major, implement Security Protocol 7 immediately. All military units are to report their status within the hour. Any unit that fails to respond should be considered potentially compromised. The major nodded and began issuing orders through his radio. Within minutes, the government's emergency response network was activated across the country. Sankara watched these preparations with growing concern. How extensive is this operation? We're about to find out, Traoré replied grimly. But one thing is certain, tonight's events represent just the opening move in a much larger game. The drive back to the presidential palace took 40 minutes through the darkened streets of Ouagadougou. Traoré used the time to make secure calls to regional allies and international supporters, alerting them to the attempted coup and requesting diplomatic support. His conversation with the Russian ambassador was particularly enlightening. Captain Traoré, we have been monitoring unusual American military communications in your region. Moscow is prepared to provide technical assistance in securing your government's communications networks. Thank you, Ambassador Volkov, but we prefer to maintain our independence from all external powers. We will accept technical cooperation, but not dependence. The Russian diplomat's chuckle was audible through the encrypted line. Of course, Captain. That is precisely why certain parties are working so hard to remove you from power. When they reached the palace, Traoré found his cabinet in emergency session. The ministers and military commanders who had gathered looked relieved to see their president alive and unharmed, but their faces reflected the gravity of the situation. Defense Minister Kabore stood as Traoré entered the secure conference room. Mr. President, we have confirmed that American operatives contacted at least 8 senior military officers over the past month. 4 have been detained, but others may still be at large. What about civilian leadership? Were any politicians involved in this conspiracy? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests that several opposition leaders were promised positions in a transitional government. Traoré took his seat at the head of the conference table. Gentlemen, tonight we faced the most serious threat to our sovereignty since independence. The question now is how we respond. Foreign Minister Sawadogo leaned forward. Mr. President, the international implications of detaining CIA personnel are significant. We should expect immediate pressure from Washington and its allies. Let them pressure us, Traoré replied firmly. We have documented evidence of foreign interference in our internal affairs. Any government that condemns us for defending our sovereignty reveals its own imperial ambitions. But even as they planned their response to the immediate crisis, Traoré knew that the real battle was just beginning. The Americans and their allies would not simply accept defeat. They would regroup, find new allies among his enemies, and try again. Intelligence Minister Compaoré spread several documents across the table. Sir, these are the financial records we recovered from the American operation. They show payments to multiple individuals, including some surprising names. Traoré studied the documents carefully. Among the recipients of American funds were two prominent civil society leaders who had been publicly critical of foreign interference. The irony was not lost on him. It appears our friends in Washington have been playing multiple sides, he observed. They fund both government critics and military conspirators, ensuring they have assets regardless of who comes to power. Sankara, who had been quietly listening to the briefings, finally spoke up. Mr. President, I request permission to address the other officers who were contacted by the Americans. Perhaps some of them can still be brought back from this conspiracy. Traoré considered this carefully. Amadou, that's extremely dangerous. If they've committed fully to the American plan, approaching them could trigger their backup protocols. With respect, sir, these are men I've served with for years. I know their hearts. Some of them may have been manipulated just as I was. The president nodded slowly. Very well. But you'll go with a full security detail, and you'll wear recording equipment. We need to document any admissions of conspiracy. As the emergency session continued into the early morning hours, reports continued to arrive from across the country. American operatives had been spotted in 3 different provinces, and several military units had reported unusual orders from unknown sources. The scope of the operation was becoming clear. This was not simply an attempt to remove one leader, it was a comprehensive effort to destabilize the entire Sahel region and restore Western control over its resources and strategic positions. Dawn was breaking over Ouagadougou when Traoré finally dismissed his cabinet. The immediate crisis had been contained, but he knew that the hardest challenges lay ahead. Sankara remained behind as the other officials departed. Ibrahim, I need to ask you something directly. Have you made any commitments to the Russians or Chinese that compromise our independence? Traoré met his friend's gaze directly. Amadou, I have made no commitments to any foreign power that compromise our sovereignty. The accusations against me were fabricated to justify foreign intervention. Then why are the Americans so determined to remove you? Because I've demonstrated that African leaders don't have to choose between competing imperial powers. We can chart our own course, control our own resources, and make our own decisions about international partnerships. Sankara nodded, satisfied with this explanation. That's what I needed to hear. As the sun rose over the capital, Traoré stood at his office window, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. The events of the past night had revealed the true nature of the challenges facing not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa. The old systems of control were adapting to a changing world, using new methods to maintain their dominance. But they had underestimated the determination of a new generation of African leaders who refused to accept the limitations imposed by history. His secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mali's military leader. "Captain Traoré, we've been monitoring the situation in your country. Similar approaches have been made to officers in our military as well. Colonel Goita, it appears we're facing a coordinated regional operation. Perhaps it's time to formalize our cooperation." "I agree completely. The Sahel will stand together against foreign manipulation." Similar calls came throughout the morning from Niger, Guinea, and other West African nations. The American operation had inadvertently catalyzed the very unity it was designed to prevent. By afternoon, the government had released a comprehensive statement documenting the foreign interference attempt. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded conversations, financial transfers, tactical equipment, and the testimony of captured operatives. International reaction was swift and divided. Western governments condemned the detention of American personnel and demanded their immediate release. African, Asian, and Latin American governments expressed support for Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty. But Traoré knew that diplomatic support would not be enough. The forces that had attempted to remove him would regroup and try again, using different methods and different allies. That evening, as he prepared for a national address to explain the crisis to his people, Traoré reflected on how close they had come to losing everything they had built. The conspiracy had nearly succeeded not through superior firepower or resources, but by exploiting the trust and loyalty that bound his inner circle together. By turning his closest friend against him, the Americans had almost achieved what direct military action could never accomplish. As he walked to the television studio, Sankara fell into step beside him. "Ibrahim, what message will you give the people tonight?" "The truth, Amadou. That their independence is under constant threat, but that it can be defended by those willing to pay the price." The national address was broadcast live across the country and picked up by international news networks. Traoré spoke for 30 minutes, explaining the events of the past 24 hours and their broader implications for African sovereignty. "My fellow citizens," he concluded, "what happened here was not an isolated incident. It was part of a global pattern of foreign interference designed to maintain systems of exploitation and dependence. But it was also proof that these systems can be resisted when we stand together." The speech was met with massive demonstrations of support across the country. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets, not in protest, but in celebration of their government's resistance to foreign manipulation. But Traoré knew that popular support, while crucial, would not protect them from future attacks. They needed to build stronger institutions, deeper alliances, and more effective defenses against foreign interference. Over the following weeks, the government implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future coups and foreign manipulation. New protocols were established for vetting military promotions, monitoring financial transactions, and detecting foreign intelligence activities. The detained CIA operatives became a significant diplomatic issue. The United States demanded their release while Burkina Faso insisted on a full investigation of their activities. Eventually, a compromise was reached through African Union mediation, with the operatives released in exchange for American commitments to respect African sovereignty. But the most important outcome of the crisis was the strengthening of bonds between African governments facing similar pressures. What had begun as an attempt to isolate and remove one leader had instead catalyzed unprecedented unity among African nations. Months later, As Traoré reviewed reports of similar operations that had been thwarted in other African countries, he realized that the night in the warehouse had marked a turning point not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. The old systems of control were still powerful, still dangerous, and still determined to maintain their dominance. But they now faced a generation of African leaders who understood their methods and were prepared to resist them. Sankara, who had been promoted to chief of staff as a reward for his loyalty during the crisis, often joined Traoré for evening walks around the palace grounds. During one such walk, he asked a question that had been troubling him. "Ibrahim, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't realized the truth in time?" Traoré considered this carefully. "Amadou, I think that crisis revealed something important about all of us. When the moment came to choose between easy lies and difficult truths, you chose correctly. That's what gives me hope for our country's future." The two men continued their walk in comfortable silence, both understanding that their friendship had been tested in the crucible of conspiracy and had emerged stronger than before. As the months passed, other attempts were made to destabilize the government through different means: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and support for armed opposition groups. But none succeeded, partly because the government had learned to recognize and counter foreign interference, and partly because the people had developed a deeper understanding of the threats to their independence. The warehouse where Traoré had been held captive was eventually converted into a museum documenting foreign interference in African affairs. Visitors could see the chair where he had been bound, the documents outlining the conspiracy, and testimonials from other African leaders who had faced similar threats. But the real monument to that night's events was not a building or a memorial. It was the example of a small African nation that had refused to bow to external pressure and had inspired others to follow the same path. Years later, when historians wrote about the turning point in Africa's struggle for true independence, many would point to a night in an abandoned warehouse in Ouagadougou, where trust was tested, loyalty was proven, and the bonds of friendship proved stronger than the schemes of imperial powers. The rebel who had taken Traoré hostage had ultimately freed him in more ways than one. By forcing him to confront the reality of foreign interference, by testing his closest relationships, and by revealing the true scope of the threats facing African sovereignty, that night had prepared him for the larger battles that lay ahead. And in the end, those battles would be won not through superior weapons or resources, but through the same qualities that had saved him in the warehouse: the loyalty of true friends, the courage to speak difficult truths, and the determination to resist all forms of domination, no matter how cleverly disguised. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.